Hello, I'm Amanda Maxim. I'm a writer and a research associate here at the Ayn Rand Institute, and I'm sitting down with Elan Journo. He's a fellow and director of policy research at the Ayn Rand Institute. And we're here to talk about the new deal struck with Iran. The deal, which opens Iran up to inspections with the threat of economic sanctions, is meant to slow Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. So, Elan, Americans, I think, are wary of the Iranian regime. We're worried that they're developing a bomb in secret, and we're worried about what they might do with it. And this deal seems like about the first diplomatic contact that we've had with Iran in about 30 years. Why have the countries been apart for so long?
You need to go back to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, which brought to power the regime that we know today, which is a totalitarian Islamic regime that tries to make Islamic law govern every aspect of life. And the initial trigger that broke apart the U.S. relationship with Iran was the invasion of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, November 4th, 1979. And that became a great humiliation to the U.S. because the Iranians paraded American diplomats whom they kept hostage for 444 days. And this was the beginning of Iran's attempt to prove itself as a worthy adversary to the United States, which it sees as an enemy. So Iran has seen us as an enemy for decades now. After the embassy attack, the invasion of the embassy, what you see is a series of attacks by Iran and by its proxies across the region against American interests. So Iranian proxies killed 241 Marines in Lebanon in the 1980s. And there were subsequent kidnappings and murders of Americans. So you see this escalating series of attacks against America. It all adds up to what I regard as a proxy war that Iran has been waging against us for upwards of 30 years, even if we don't regard it as a war against us. So you can understand why the two have been at odds and why, in fact, we should be even more suspicious of Iran.
So it sounds like there's good reason for us to be wary of Iran. On the other hand, Obama and people on the left have said, look, this is a negotiation. It's not going to be perfect. This is about the best deal that we could have hoped to get from Iran. What do you think about it?
I think the way people are celebrating this deal is really revealing, because what they're doing is separating out Iran as a regime from Iran's nuclear program. And we're just going to deal with the Iran nuclear program, keep it in a silo, and pretend that that's all that we can focus on. And in that respect, they're saying, well, this deal slows down the nuclear program, and we're going to deal with all the rest of the stuff they're doing, backing jihadist groups, killing Americans in Iraq, all of the rest of the stuff that we know and recognize as Iran supporting all kinds of terrorism. We're going to put that to one side and deal with that separately. But you can't separate the two. They go together. They come from the same source, which is the Iranian regime's ideological character, which sets its goals and an agenda, which is it sees itself as the embodiment of a certain ideology, the idea of totalitarian Islam, Islamic totalitarianism. And it tries to expand its reach, subjugate people within its own borders, and it's a horrific violator of individual rights within its own purview. And then it tries to expand its power across the region. So that is what explains its backing of all these jihadists, and that is what explains its pursuit of a nuclear weapon. And you can't separate the two. It is perversely short-sighted to pretend that the big problem is the Iran nuclear problem. Well, we only worry about it having a nuclear weapon because of the regime it is. Other regimes have nuclear weapons, and it's not a problem. It's not the weapon per se. It's the regime that would pursue it and might use it that we are concerned about, but even if we don't admit it to ourselves. So the fundamental problem here is the Iranian regime, and the idea that you can just treat its nuclear program in isolation is really wrong-headed.
So Benjamin Netanyahu, he's prime minister of Israel, he called the deal historic, and I don't think he meant that in the good sense. And a lot of people on the right here in the United States have also criticized the deal, saying it didn't go far enough. What do you make of the criticisms?
They have some merit. I mean, it's a terrible deal on its own terms. America made many concessions along the way, both in the negotiations and getting to the negotiations. And all of that, I think, is true, but I reject the premise of that perspective or that criticism, which is we should have held out for some better deal. I don't think there was some better deal, or even that pursuing a deal with Iran is the right path to take, which I think is completely wrong. Apart from all the material gains that Iran is going to reap from this, the money that is going to be freed up, and its ability to pursue its backing of Islamic terrorists across the region and elsewhere, that's a problem, and we should be worried about that. But the bigger part, which hasn't been acknowledged, is merely bringing Iran to the table, treating it as if it were a civilized country, treating it as if it has this moral standing that deserves negotiation. That confers on it a moral legitimacy that it doesn't deserve, and it really wants to have that, even as it calls us all sorts of horrific names and chants death to America. The Iranian regime, being an outlaw, being a dictatorship, a theocracy that violates rights and seeks to subjugate people and initiates aggression, given that that's its character, it wants the moral cover of legitimacy. And that is a big part of what these negotiations did, even apart from all the concessions and goodies that Iran is able to collect. So the idea that there is some better deal with a regime like that, I think that's completely wrong. You should not even pursue that path given the character of the regime and what it's committed to doing. It sees itself as an enemy of the US, and it is acting on that goal.
But the deal, it does seem strict. I mean, there's vigorous inspections that are called for and verification processes. Do you think there's any chance it could be effective?
I think to believe that it could be effective is something that requires an act of faith. I mean, you have to believe in miracles to believe that this is going to prevent a nuclear Iran. First, the record on nuclear inspections and so forth, it is a very sorry record. If you want another example, there were differences between the Iran deal and the deal with North Korea 21 years ago. But that deal is really telling of what this sort of thing looks like. So North Korea is a confirmed nuclear power now. It's also sold its technology and it's armed other groups. So it didn't work well in North Korea. And the argument, well, Iran is different. No, Iran is in some ways worse than North Korea because at every step they've been lying and cheating. And there's no reason to think they're going to stop that, even with all the elegant mechanisms that have been touted as controlling Iran's ability to go nuclear. And the essential part is that this is the idea that all these mechanisms will work presupposes that Iran is a regime that you can trust. The United Kingdom has nuclear weapons. Now, if you impose these kinds of restrictions on the United Kingdom somehow, if you imagine that scenario, there's every reason to think it's going to work, because the United Kingdom is a regime that you have reason to believe will follow, give you its word and act on it and so on. But Iran is not like that. It's a very different kind of regime, and its character, its ideological goal is relevant to thinking about what kind of agreement, even if you could imagine an agreement with a regime like that. The idea that some elegant mechanism of control and inspection, which is not nearly as significant as people are touting it, that is somehow going to keep us safe, I think that really is in the realm of fantasy.
Well, Obama said, look, here are the options. Either we resolve the issue diplomatically through negotiations, or we go to war. And going to war doesn't seem like something that we want to do. What do you think about that?
I think it's a false alternative on both sides of that equation. So it's false to say that what we're pursuing now is some sort of sound, rational, cool-headed diplomatic remedy that has some chance of making us safer. I think that is a mischaracterization of what we're doing. I think what's accurate is to say we've been given a diagnosis that we have a lethal disease that's progressing rapidly, and our remedy for that is to take a fistful of placebos, swallow them, and hope for the best. Now, that in any medical context would be a bad idea, to put it mildly. And what we're doing diplomatically is exactly that. We're evading the real problem, which is this growing menace from Iran. And on the other side of this alternative that Obama and others are presenting is it's either our sophisticated solution of diplomacy, which has some positive, versus war. Now, look, we can all agree war is undesirable, and it should only be pursued in self-defense, in my view. But I think we've reached that criteria, and I think Iran has proven itself a menace even without nuclear weapons over the last 30 plus years. It is a growing menace. It is seeking to harm American interests. It has already done so. And it should be, the time for diplomacy and sanctions and so on, that was conceivable 30 years ago at the beginning of this. But now that we've gotten into this problem and allowed Iran to get stronger and closer to nuclear weapons, the time for that remedy is long gone. It's not realistic. It's not what's appropriate. What's necessary is military coercion. Now, it's important to say, because the comeback to that is, well, you're asking for another Iraq, right?
Yeah.
Who wants that? And that's not what I'm saying. Nobody should want another Iraq, because Iraq was a disaster, and I'm not a supporter of Iraq, the Iraq War. And my chief criticism of it, which I lay out in my book, Winning the Unwinnable War, is that the Iraq War was not a war in self-defense. It was not a self-interested war. It was a war in which our policies were irrational and seeking to serve the needs of Iraqis above our own self-defense. So this was a nation-building war, a war to bring democracy to the Middle East. That's not in our interest. And I lay this out in detail, but the essential point is that the Iraq War was not what a real war looks like. It was much worse than it needed to be. It was a disaster from top to bottom, a political, not a military disaster. And yet the way it's understood is this discredits military action per se in any context, because naturally people think the military option looks like Iraq. Who wants that? But it's both unjust to the military, who were brave and had to act under considerable constraints. Their hands were tied in ways that people don't really appreciate. And it's unfair to us, because what we need is a military that really advances our self-interest, our defense, our security. And that, I think, is what is called for in this context. We need a military solution. It doesn't look like Iraq, but it's the point where this is the option we've left ourselves, and it's an urgent one.
All right, thank you, Elan Journo.